All right, Sam. Well, the Minnesota Wild look to square off for the St. Louis Blues in Game 3 tonight. Series all tied up, one game apiece. Puck drops at 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Sam, we've started every Wild segment this week talking about the goalie situation, so I stop now. Tell me your overall thoughts on the decision to go with Marc-Andre Fleury the first two games, and do you expect him to get a rest now in Game 3 and go back to the hot hand of Cam Talbot?
I think they're riding Fleury now. I mean, I think that could change with a bad performance by Fleury. But, I mean, Dean Evison came out and basically said, hey, we watched the first game. We don't feel like Marc-Andre was at fault for most of those goals. They credited him with making the initial stop and then sort of criticized the defense for not clearing the puck and, allowing bodies to get in front of the net and allowing rebounds to get scooped up. So they didn't hold Fleury as accountable in that first game as maybe we would have watching it. So now after a nice Game 2 bounce back, I think playoff hockey is all about riding the hot hand. You don't alternate. If you got a good thing going on, if you want to stick with it, you stick with it. So unless something happens with his play, if it were to deteriorate over the weekend in St. Louis and we come back on Monday and the Wild are down 3-1, then I think we talk. But I think until then, I think they're riding Fleury.
Boy, going to be really interesting to see. Again, all week we talked about just kind of how shocked, maybe a little even disappointed we were not going with the hot hand in Cam Talbot. But here we are, series split up, one game apiece. Going to be really interesting to see when they announce that decision later on today. We talked injuries with Seth Topol. I'm wondering if we have any type of updates at all. I mean, again, I think injuries playing a little bit bigger factor at this late in the season, heading into the playoffs. Anything on the injury front that you've heard of from either team, both the St. Louis Blues and Minnesota Wild, who seem to be quietly a little bit banged up right now?
Yeah, for the Blues, it's the defenseman. And I know they had to call up a defenseman from sort of their minor league system or kind of off the roster, which tells you that the injuries are legit. You can't really fake a transaction like that.
Right.
So that's not a red herring. That's legitimate. They're going to be missing some talent there on that blue line, including former Wild Marco Scandella, if you remember from 5 years back or so. And what is the blue line responsible for? It's stopping those forwards down low. And what is the Wild strength? It's that forward play with Hartman and Kaprizov and Zuccarello and Fiala. So that could definitely lead to a Wild surge offensively. And I think we already saw it a bit. I mean, the Blues were banged up in Game 2 at the blue line, and the Wild scored half a dozen on them. So I think if those injuries continue to mount and they've got, their third and fourth D-men in the 1 and 2 spots, just sort of the trickle-down effect is, well, suddenly your third defensive pairing is really weak, So that's the matchup the Wild want to exploit. And it's a little harder to exploit on the road because you don't have last change, but I think the Wild certainly are in the driver's seat there in the health department.
Good point there. Wild get crushed Game 1, 4-0, go 0 for 6 on those power plays. They come back, though, 2 for 3 right out the gate and dominate on Wednesday night, tied the series back up. That's got to be one of the bigger X factors for me, just their special teams unit and how effective they can be on those power plays again tonight. Kind of like which Wild special teams unit are we going to see in Game 3? What's maybe another X factor you think could ultimately decide this game here tonight?
Yeah, you're right. The special teams have been Jekyll Hyde, but I think just discipline, and this relates to special teams, but how many penalties are you taking as a team? The stats show that they've been calling almost a penalty more per team per game in the playoffs than they did the regular season. It was a pretty lax regular season in terms of power play opportunities. There wasn't as much called. In fact, they set an NHL record for the fewest power play opportunities per game in the season. But it's actually ratcheted up in the playoffs where they're calling more penalties. They're actually calling it pretty tightly, which a lot of times you assume that, well, they're going to let them play. It's the playoffs. But no, they've actually kind of locked things down. And we saw that in Game 1 where the Wild had a million opportunities and they just couldn't cash in on any of them. But they can't give the Blues those opportunities. Like we mentioned, the Blues have been the Wild's kryptonite. And during that stretch, that long 14-game stretch we talked about where the Blues had won 12 of 14, I think they were 32% on power plays against the Wild. I mean, their power play unit is very good, as exhibited by what they did in Game 1. David Perron with the hat trick. They basically had 3 power play goals. So the Wild have to obviously remain disciplined. That wasn't their strength in the regular season. They actually did take quite a few penalties. So staying out of the box, it's a little harder on the road. Sometimes the home crowd can influence things too. So you maybe don't get mixed up in some of those skirmishes in front of the net or along the boards. Keep the game clean so that you can keep your 5 on the ice.
You mentioned yesterday, maybe home ice just not quite as important or big of a factor. So hopefully that's the case. Again, game 3 tonight, 8:30 puck drops. Rest assured, we'll be back here Monday to break down all the action.